Okay, folks, I guess we should get going. Hopefully everything is working right. Um, it's a little hard to say these days. Everything seems to be going uh, kind of crazy. Um, I don't know what you have heard around your place, but of course, Summer's online, and they have a contingency plan for the fall if it's online. So I think the general mood, general consensus is that yeah, there's a pretty good shot that fall might be online too. So um, it's a new world and new patterns of thinking, new ways of problem solving, new ways of dealing with student needs, all those things that kind of have to happen out there that higher education is a part of, um, and a whole lot of old ideas about how to get there. So it'll be kind of interesting. So I thought it was kind of an appropriate as I went through and kind of weaned off some topics and content. If you'll notice, I left one uh, piece of material here actually showing up for two sessions. Although I don't know that we'll need meet next week. I think that's next week is probably going to be a kind of a help session type thing where I'll try to meet with as many folks individually over the next week or 10 days or so as I possibly can. Uh, if you request and kind of talk through some of the thoughts and issues that you may be going through in terms of getting work done. Uh, I know I've had some dilemmas with that because it seems as if everything that normally would be handled in a semester fairly simply is just not happening this semester. And a lot of the things, the task force and the committees and we're trying to hit some targets for the state in terms of certification changes and uh, getting through people finishing doc programs when they can't get into the schools or into higher ed institutions to get any data. And I mean, it's been an interesting semester, but we're getting there. I've managed to plow through a bunch of stuff and toss it off. So now the last 2 weeks, all I'll be doing is reading class material for this class and the other two uh, assessment and evaluation sections that I'm leading this semester for pre-service teachers. So it is a kind of an interesting challenge to get to all those places and do all those things. Um, it's funny you have you schedule. I don't know if it's happened to you. You schedule a face-to-face meeting and everybody shows up. You get everybody to show up, then the meeting just seems to drag on forever because everybody's got to say their piece. Uh, you do Zoom meetings, boom, they're gone. You do it, you're out of there. It's like you accomplish just as much in 45 minutes as you do sitting 2 hours in a committee meeting. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that we've stumbled into, and we need to figure it out. Does that work? Is that a real thing or whatever? But anyhow, I thought the notion of a learning organization and learning institution, uh, learning company, whatever term you want to put on it, is an interesting topic for this particular time and the things that we're going through, because all of our institutions have to become learning organizations. Uh, we were having a committee meeting the other day, and we were talking about somebody was talking about, well, we just have to kind of do this, that, and the other until we can get back to normal. And I couldn't help but make the comment that we won't get back to normal. The old processes are going away. We'll come up with a whole bunch of new processes. And so we'll end up at to use a trite term, a new normal, but it won't look like anything like the old normal, because you know, that monster, that beast is probably gone now, and now we have to figure out how to do things in a different way, because you know, this coronavirus not only has a tremendous health impact and a tremendous economic impact, but it is also changing culture as we kind of understand it worldwide. And you're starting to see, you know, shifts in thought processes, shifts in understanding about how to get things done, and you know, things like that. So we will end up with a normal. It will be, in my mind, quite different than the old normal, but it'll be the new normal. So, what are your thoughts on any of that before we get into stuff?
Yeah, I got a just a situation I'd like to talk about a little bit. We every summer, you know, because the Air Force Academy is a military organization, we have a lot of turnover with folks that have done their 2 or 3 years. You know, captains and majors, and are going to move on to a different assignment. We're doing that same onboarding this summer, but we're going to do it all remotely. Now, us that are there right now are a pretty tight team. We've worked together. We've done all these projects together and handle these issues. So we're faring okay now that we're doing things online. I mean, certainly there's some struggles, but we're doing okay because it was a pretty tight team. But to add about a third of the people in brand new and try to integrate them in, you know, looking at each other on the screens like this, I'm just a little antsy about how that's going to work out, and whether those folks are actually going to get what they need to be brought into the team, or you know, how that's going to fare out. We're hoping it's just this summer and then we're back to at least on site next year, but yeah, that may not be the case. So I don't know if anybody else is in that situation, if they've, you know, done stop hirings and stuff like that, but you know, we're planning on quite a load of new people coming in this summer. It should be interesting.
Anybody want to respond to Greg?
I guess I would say I think you would need to do a lot of community building. And if you're using Zoom, maybe using the breakout room feature, and just a lot of icebreakers and things that people get to us, that they're building a sense of community while they're working on, you know, whatever it is that they're doing as part of. I don't really know the mission, so it's hard for me to know how to to help, but just building that sense of community so that little by little, maybe even a mentor relationship with those that are already there, with those that are new that are coming in.
It sounds like a great opportunity to do a research study of the different methods of onboarding and team building through the different settings. Like, what does this one team look like compared to the ones in the past? So even though it may not be the solution you're looking for, it may be able to give good information about what things were missing this way versus, or what things were better this way. So I think it'd be a good chance to actually collect some data on the delivery of how you guys get your teams going.
I think one interesting thing, Greg, is that you can celebrate the fact that these, I don't know if they're cadets or what, or you said captains, that they are able to continue their careers, that they're not stifled in their careers. You know, at my place of work, we've lost all of our part-time help. So, and they're not all getting unemployment. So this is, I mean, it is positive that they can at least continue and can grow. It's going to be challenging, but that is a huge blessing, and they still get paychecks. So
Good stuff. Thanks.
Well, Greg, just one thought for me. You know, you have an advantage in some sense in that you have a group of individuals that all have a coherent, common training experience background. Now their deployment experiences will be different, and you know what they did in different places will be different, but they have essentially a common training background with which to work from. The other thing is probably also, you know, this notion of understanding of mission. I know that's a real important element within the military setting, but it's also an important element in any organizational setting, is understand the mission and have a sort of a common understanding, at least not, if not 100%, but you know, the major threads of it, and not maybe how it plays out. So I would probably build on what you have in common, and you know, the way in which you kind of build out a community from, you know, that setting into this new setting, new things that they might not be used to, or interactions with students that they you know, that may not fit exactly within the chain of command sorts of notions. And I think in one of the dilemmas in the military academies is that they can't be strictly chain of command, though that's where you want to get to. But you know, these kids, for lack of a better term, these 18, 19-year-olds coming in the door, they're not quite necessarily at that point yet where they get kind of the rationale and the importance of chain of command. And you know, they're a little loose in their interpretation of some of those things. And you know, some of them get there quicker than others, but you know, that having people come in to be on the quote unquote faculty and staff there that are not familiar with, you know, the vagaries of an 18 or 19-year-old, and how you're trying to, you know, build them into a culture so that, you know, 3 or 4 years later, when they go out the door, there's somebody you would like to send off to protect the country. I mean, that's maybe they understand that part of it, but they don't understand how do you get from, you know, these 18, 19-year-olds to that point.
Yeah, that's very true, and you're right that you know, the active duty folks that are coming in, these junior officers that are coming in, you know, they've got a couple moves under their belts, and the military is really good about, you know, we get uprooted every 2 or 3 years, so you're pretty good at jumping into a group of new people and getting acclimated pretty well. So they have the advantage. The cadets, on the other hand, especially those who don't have any experience with the military, their parents weren't or not, the first summer we bring them in before their freshman year, and they've got 6 weeks, and it's basically like basic training to break them down and build them up, you know, like we want them, so they can fit into the cadet squadrons. And you know, they're talking about, hey, are we going to do this online? That's a whole nother problem right there that we have to correct.
I'm still working on the drop and give me 25 online. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but
right.
Yeah. I might make a recording of 5 and duplicate it 5 times. And anytime anybody says that, I'll pop that recording real quick. You know,
and then when you all meet in person and you're like, shouldn't you be in better shape by now?
Well, you can't even run a mile. What are you doing? What's wrong with you? Yeah, I can see enormous issues and kind of trying to do that sort of cultural breakdown and build up that you need to do in the military. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, there are, we're kind of, I don't know, fiddling around with how do we go about maximizing this sort of online learning notion and process. And you know, so many individuals within the institution, their basic take on online learning is, I'm just going to take everything that I used to do in the classroom and I'm going to put it on As You Learn, or I'm going to put it, you know, on Zoom, or I'm going to put it on something else, you know, Apple Docs or whatever, and G Suite, or, you know, then I'll just do it the way I always did it. It's just that, you know, I won't have to stand up to do it. And you know, I've seen that at other institutions before, and so I think it's that's a real concern among folks because it is a different pedagogy.
Well, it's going to have a key impact too. I've been reading a lot of articles lately, or even just posts from freshmen or incoming freshmen that are about to make their choices if they haven't on what campus they're going to. And a lot of people are starting to go, if we're not going to be face to face in the fall, I'm not sure I want to go to my first pick, or I'm not sure I want to go to 4-year. Maybe I'm going to stay home and go to community college if it's going to be online anyways. I have a feeling this coming year is going to be very different for the freshman class based off of these experiences. Especially some campuses are talking about not even opening in the fall yet. And so if you're picking a 4-year for those opportunities of living in a dorm, doing clubs, being on campus, all of that, that's really good. If it's not a choice, that's really going to change what happens to 4 years in the fall.
Yeah, I've had a lot of discussions with close friends. I have a couple of guys that I've known pretty well that are deans of colleges of business at different places. And so much of the College of Business experience is all about networking and, team oriented sorts of things. And, once again, building trust as a team, and, it's a team accomplishment sort of idea. And even to the point that, if you go to most institutions, you'll find that the largest portion of individuals in fraternities and sororities are disproportionately out of the College of Business, because they see that as a networking kind of another team building experience, and it's encouraged by deans and folks like that in the College of Business, that they join different social or Panhellenic sorts of things, and so they do. And so I can imagine those experiences are going to be quite different for kids coming in, for students coming in. And we just once again, it's that learning organization. We have to adapt, we have to learn, we have to figure out what's the new ways, what will be this new normal, how will we do it, how will we go about figuring it out. And that, to me, that sounds like a really daunting but interesting challenge that higher ed is kind of faced with. And it's about time that we had a real challenge of kind of thinking about how we do things, and quit worrying about parking spaces and copies and all those other things that we tend to argue and gripe about, and really look at fundamental structures and how do we do things, and what does this new culture that we're trying to create on these institutions, what's the new culture going to look like? What are the interrelationships? What are the interactions? And if nothing else, I think we will learn some things from this online experience, remote experience, that we'll want to incorporate even when we get back, because we discovered it's an efficiency, or it's a better way, or it works. So it is kind of a daunting period of time coming up, but I think it's a fairly exciting one too. There's lots of opportunity. They say out of chaos comes the best opportunities, and that's kind of always been what I've always kind of thought, that a chaotic environment is actually a better one to work out of if you have things to offer, if you want to take advantage of opportunities, because that's where the most opportunities are. But we'll see, or you'll see, in about 2 or 3 years, I won't worry about it anymore, but you'll have to worry about it. And so it's up to you is to figure out how to work around all that, and how to work with it. Other thoughts before we get into talking just a little bit about learning organizations? Okay. Well, there's just a touch of historical piece to this, and I kind of want to talk just very, very briefly about the 20th century, sort of 1980. We'll use 1980 as a dividing line. before 1980 and after 1980, and how organizations were structured. And you know, prior to, in fact, let me turn on my little doohickey here so I can actually make some sense out of it. It's supposed to, there we go. So you know, I'm thinking, you know, prior to 1980, and we'll use, as I said, we'll use 1980 as a dividing line. What was in, you know, what companies and organizations do is, as they develop, they try to figure out, you know, efficiencies that will make them better than someone else. You know, in like in retail, we talk about efficiencies of price, efficiencies of place, efficiencies of time, efficiencies of selection. You know, you try to create some competitive advantage based on, you know, some efficiencies that you're able to create. But prior to 1980s, all those efficiencies were built primarily off of one concept, and that was scale. You know, efficiencies of scale. And so, you know, organizations needed to be big. They had to be, the bigger the organization, the more they produced, the lower the cost per unit, the more they could ship, the lower the cost per unit shipped. You know, you get some efficiencies based on size. But because of this little concept called span of control, the little management concept, that said that, you know, you could only debate, depending on the complexity of the assignment, the complexity of the job, you could only manage X amount of people at a time. And, you know, in you know, if let's say you're in a management level, supervisory level position, you can probably manage maybe 8 or 10 people at a time. And as you built out this scale, and this thing got, you know, bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of the scale, you needed more and more and more levels in here to be able to manage it because of the span of control. Because once you get all the way down to the bottom, you get to basically the production floor or the workspace or the work floor or whatever, you need to have, you know, a supervisor or team leader for every 8 to 10 people. And so if you have, say, an organization that has, you know, there were some of the large corporations, large plants and all out in the Midwest that had 30 or 40,000 employees. And you had, you know, one guy at the top, the CEO. And below him, you go down and you figure out how many levels you have to have until you get to the, you know, 8 to 10 or 12 at each level in that span of control. And you realize you end up with, you know, just level on top of level on top of level. And you have VPs and assistant VPs and second VPs and third VPs. And you have, you know, managers and assistant managers. I mean, it goes berserk. And so most of what we had in organizational settings, and to a certain extent, it still happens in higher ed a lot, is we had all these in business and industry, we call them all middle managers, middle management. And what happened around 1980, a little bit before, a little bit after, you know, kind of a transition period there, is that suddenly we became a global economy, a more global economy. Because all those countries that we had, that were devastated during World War II, we had helped recover, and now they were all recovering to the point where they were competitors. Plus money flowed across borders. You know, there was no longer any transfer of funds. Funds, you know, flowed by computer, by wire, whatever. Money flowed across borders. You know, plants could locate in different places and get benefits of economies related to salary and, you know, all those sorts of things. But the new efficiency was speed. And so after 1980, instead of efficiencies of scale, we had efficiencies of speed. The companies that could respond the fastest, or the organizations that could respond the fastest, were the most successful. And that was inconsistent with large organizations. And so suddenly, you know, the complex industrial folks were not building plants that would employ 30,000 people. They were building plants that would employ 300. And so instead of building one big plant, they'd build, you know, 100 small plants. And they would locate them all near distribution channels, logistic channels. And so they could, you know, they could move stuff, make stuff and move stuff where it needed to go, because the efficiency was speed. And what speed did was gave them two things. It gave them the ability to get to the market before the competitors, and it gave them the ability to retool and change product and change service more quickly than their competitors. And so speed became the issue. And so instead of having these layers and layers and layers of middle management, now suddenly we had very flat organizations, small organizations with limited management. And we had to have employees that made a lot of their own decisions and could work in groups, and because you couldn't think about this whole span of control anymore. You didn't need all those levels. And so what happened in the 80s and, you know, during that time period, the middle management just disappeared. And I don't know if you remember anything about this. It was certainly a long time ago. But during the 80s and all, a lot of people were being let go in middle management roles. And it was because those roles were disappearing. Those levels were disappearing altogether as plants and organizations downsized into many smaller subcomponents located in different places. And so, you know, Peter Senge, you know, Peter Drucker was probably the man that was most synonymous with the ideas of efficiencies of scale and efficiencies in the workplace, which makes sense because he was an engineer. And so he was all about efficiencies. But Peter Senge came along, who was more of a futurist philosopher type, and talked about this idea of learning corporations, learning organizations. But, you know, places that were built to be fast, built to make decisions close to the workspace or the shop floor. And so we had a whole new type of organization that was developed, and that became kind of the standard. And so, you know, what happened down here was this whole idea of learning organizations. And if you know, I'm going to give you, there's a handout that we're going to talk about in a minute, but we talk about the definition of learning organizations. And you'll see that there are about 7 or 8 definitions, and there are a whole bunch of guys that have different definitions. And all of them are, you know, prominent scholars in, you know, industrial management and organizational management, and organizational theory and all that. But they have all kind of different takes on it, but they have some characteristics that are very, very similar, in that the organizations are based upon the workers at the most seminal level of an organization. Now, if you think about higher education, what are those workers that are at the most seminal level? Those are the staff people and the academic people that have direct contact with students. And members above, you know, organizational administrative members above, don't have that direct contact. And so a lot of the changes, a lot of the efficiencies all are gained by giving folks at the basic academic level and the basic staff level a little bit more leeway to make some decisions and, you know, make some choices as to how you know, they might accomplish certain things. Now, that is at odds, almost 180 degrees, with the typical thought process in higher ed institutions, which tend to be very hierarchical. And so, you know, that's the dilemma, in that we need to be, you know, we've known this now for 30 or 40 years, we need to be this new type of organization. And the only higher ed institutions that have managed to pull that off are a lot of the community college systems and private for profit. You know, private for profit does it for a different reason. You know, the more people they have to pay, the less profit they make. So, you know, they kind of operate on that model. But, you know, higher education is yeah, at least community college, there is a lot of efficiencies that are gained by giving folks at the faculty level and departmental level a lot of leeway to make some decisions. And it's kind of a little bit of a scary notion, but this idea of a learning corporation is kind of where we're headed. Thoughts on that brief, also brief, all too brief history lesson about the change of organizational structure and organizational culture? But if you look at 1980 or so, that's really about the dividing line. And what we see after that's quite different from what we see before that in corporations and companies. Okay. I've told you that there are a bunch of different definitions. And let me see if I can get one of those puppies up. Okay. Here are some of the, here are 4 or 5, I guess, what I would call key different definitions of organizational learning. And, you know, out of the Academy of Management Review, Fiol and Lyles talk about organizational learning means the process of improving actions through better knowledge and understanding. You know, that one's a little bit more vague than some of the others, but it does focus on the importance of data and knowledge and understanding that data as the key to improving and creating efficiencies within the higher ed organization. George Huber, his take was, an entity learns that if through the process of information, the range of its potential behaviors is changed. In other words, this was a definition that focused on getting rid of this institutional inertia that we tend to have. That what we did last year is what we do this year, and what we do this year is what we do next year. And you know, organizations that use data, organizations that understand information and fact and data tend to be able to have a different range of actions and different range of behaviors. Barbara Levitt and James March, who are both sociologists, they said organizations are seen as learning by encoding inferences from history into routines that guide behavior. Well, the difference here is, instead of talking about using fact, using data, you know, collecting those sorts of things, their inference is that you learn how to change things by looking at what happened in the past and what did you learn from it. What worked, what didn't work, you know, what created issues, what didn't create issues. Argyris in 77 said organizational learning is a process of detecting and correcting error. And that was kind of a different approach because it did not, it looked more as an assessment evaluative sort of idea. What happened here was kind of, this was part of that beginning process. He was one of the early scholars that pushed institutions to think about creating VPs and deans of institutional effectiveness. And so you didn't see any institutional effectiveness positions prior to, say, 1980 or so. And that's where those came from, this idea of detecting and correcting error. Another term for that we used a lot in evaluating educational projects and programs was discrimination analysis. That not from an equity point of view, but from looking at what we were supposed to do, what did we actually do? And is there a difference between what we said we would deliver and what we actually delivered? And if we did, if there is, that's a discrepancy. And then what we do is analyze the discrepancy to figure out, you know, is what went wrong and how can we correct that? And then finally, Ray Stata, the Sloan Management Review, not one of my key sources. Sloan is a publication company that tends to take a bit of a vanity press approach from time to time. But Ray Stata is a very well-known and very reputable management person. And he talked about organizational learning occurs through shared insights, knowledge, and mental models, and builds on past knowledge and experiences. That is, on memory. And what they all have in common is the idea of collecting some sort of data, whether it's, you know, a narrative sort of data like memory and past histories and things like that, or whether it's data attached to metrics that are looking at things that you're currently doing in the institution, and using that data, whatever type of data it is, to guide you into a future direction. And that becomes sort of the underlying model of what a learning organization is. One that uses data of some sort to help develop and describe plans of where you need to go in the future to do better, to improve, to make a positive change in an institution. And so that's the kind of the thing that holds all these different theories about organizational learning together. Excuse me, I got a little bit of a allergy thing still going. It's wonderful. I was taking a few pictures. We're up here, you know, in Shenandoah Valley here where I live. We're at about 1,300 feet. So it's not like being at Boone or whatever. We're at 1,300 feet. But we're, you know, considerably more north than Boone. And, you know, I was just grabbing a couple of pictures this morning with my iPhone of the dogwood trees outside, almost to the point where the blooms are getting ready to fall off of them because they've already bloomed out and it's going away. You know, the cherry blossoms, things like that, they're gone. Forget about that stuff. And so here it is, you know, barely a couple of weeks into April, I guess 3 weeks into April. And, you know, we're in the middle of summer here, except 2 nights ago it was 29 degrees, and it got a lot of the Chardonnay vines in some of the local vineyards. So, 2020 Chardonnay will not be a good vintage around here. It will be a hard thing to come across, but which is sad because good Chardonnays are hard to come across. But it would be interesting to hear their take on things. I'm sure they want to learn from this experience. But is this the new climate? Is this the new thing? I don't know. Along with everything else, I guess it is. If everything else is going all to pieces, why not the climate? Why not just change all the weather patterns and bring all these new creatures into the area and different weeds to fight with and all that sort of stuff. But anyhow, they're now starting to see lots and lots and lots of alligators down in the south side of Virginia, in some of the ponds and the more lethargic rivers. And it's kind of interesting because you used to every now and then you'd hear about one. Now it's kind of like, they're talking about, well, we might have to put bounties on some of these because there's nothing up there that really kills them. They have no predators in southern Virginia, Southside Virginia. So change the world. Okay. Not about that, but any thoughts about these definitions of organizational learning, or sort of that little misanthropic history lesson? All my historian friends hate when I do that, when I compress a very complex set of changes over a period of decades into a 5-minute spiel about what actually happened. But Diane, I think you have a stalker, but you just okay. Just so that you know, not everybody has the skill set to be in a learning organization. And I know that sounds kind of paternalistic to say that or whatever, but not everybody does. And as the organizations start to change, there is a certain level of resistance to that change because not everybody is either committed or inclined or has sort of the thought process to get into that. And I'm not going to get too deep into this other handout. I just want to mention a couple of things. I'm going to have to, this comes from the Harvard Business Review a few years back. Okay. And so let me share this up because there's just like maybe one sentence there, a couple of sentences that I really want to speak to just for a second. If you, Peter Senge talked about what he called the 5 basic component technologies. Now, and a lot of these were in the new essential skills models. And so we've begun to teach these in a few years back in like STEM settings, governor's schools, specialized schools, things like that. And now we've begun to, over the last couple of decades or so, we've tried to bring them down into, the secondary and even the elementary levels, to begin to talk about how we go about helping students to acquire these skills. Now, they're separate from what we used to call critical thinking, although a lot of critical thinking models use some of these skills. And so what Sanj said that needed to happen, you needed to have individuals and technologies, which he called component technologies. He's not just talking about software and things like that. He's talking about people too. That you had to have systems thinking as a primary thing. And that's the old model of inputs, processes, outputs, logic, modeling, backwards planning, whatever type system you're used to. And you know, that came out of the notion of engineering, where you could define, if you could define what you wanted it to be, then you could think back over what you would need to do to make that happen, and then what were the resources you would need to do those things to make that happen. And so engineers used to talk all the time about IPOs, you know, and they weren't talking about initial public offerings. They were talking about inputs, processes, and outputs. That once you define what the outputs needed to be, you then could define what the processes were to get there. And then you could define what were the inputs or the resources needed to make those processes happen. And so that sort of systems thinking is a way of understanding the way in which things get done. You know, what's the work involved? What's the task involved? What's the resources that are absolutely, you know, on hand? This testing thing with coronavirus. You know what's holding up a lot of the testing? Cotton swabs. Long-handled, sterile cotton swabs. We only have about 1/10 of those that we need. And it's not a product that, you know, General Electric or one of these big plants can gear up to make. It's made in very small plants in very remote places and things like that, because it's a fairly straightforward process, not simple, but straightforward process, but it involves the sterilization and, you know, all these sorts of things. And the reagents, the chemicals that you need to test what's on these swabs. And so those two things, without their availability, you know, this testing notion is not going to get off the ground until we have cotton swabs and the reagents to work with. And so it's a resource issue. It's an input issue. We can figure out how to make them if we have enough materials to make them from. You see what happened with the mask? How many different places got into the face shields and the mask? And, you know, I know of an institution, JMU up here in their, what they call their X Lab, which is the innovation lab in their College of Integrated Science and Technology. They have a big platform 3D printer, and they printed something like 10,000 face shields in a weekend on a 3D printer. And it was because they had all these fresh materials and there are no students here to use them. And so they had the raw materials to do those things, and it was a project that, you know, some of their graduate students got into, and so they did 10,000 face shields in a weekend. And so, but they understood the system. They understood how those things could be done. Personal mastery. We're kind of back to the age of expertise a little bit. Everybody in a learning organization has to have personal mastery of some content or some function. We no longer have a kind of a jack of all trade notion. You have to have mastered something to be a contributing member. Mental models, to be able to model outcomes in your head. This whole idea of metacognition. mental mapping, all those things that have to do with the ability of creating understanding of models of behavior and models of organization within your head at a level that you can see how all the concept comes together. One of the things we learned about that in cognitive learning science or cognitive science is that learning takes place, primarily at two levels. It takes place at a factual individual activity level. In other words, think of little kids. They have to know the times tables. They have to know, there's certain factual elements that you have to have. But that only makes sense if you do it in the context of the overarching conceptual level at the same time. And so that's why we're now teaching kids as young as kindergarten numbers theory. And they do better with math if they understand numbers theory at the same time. Because we learn in parts and wholes, and we have to learn both at the same time. We can't learn purely factual information, and we can't learn purely conceptual information. Concepts have to be supported by facts. And that's the importance of mental models, be able to think about how all these things fit together. I used to talk about, if you take the best carpenter in the world and give him a whole bunch of boards and nails and all the proper equipment and all like that, and he still can't build, the house you have in your mind. You have to commit that mental image to a drawing, to a blueprint or something, but you have to be able to conceptualize that image of what it would look like. And so that's the notion of mental models. Shared vision, obviously it's like Greg, I was talking about a while ago, having a consistent idea of mission. Everybody has to be on board. And that doesn't mean you have to be on board with every strategy. You might disagree on strategies. In fact, you might, debate strategies. You'll eventually have to settle on one probably. But as long as all those strategies fit in with that vision or that mission, they're all legitimate. And then it's just a matter of the organization making the decision about which way to go. But you have to be able to think about that shared vision and how do we get there, the whole mental modeling idea. And then finally, this notion of team learning, that you never, there's a little inconsistency here in Singe, and it gets pointed out in a lot of papers. If you'll see two inconsistencies here. He talks about personal mastery, and he talks about team learning. And what he's basically saying is that every individual in a learning organization may have a different area of mastery, but they can also learn together as a team, applying their different mastery and different experiences to the same problem with other team members having different experiences than that person. And so, having this sort of personal mastery as being good at what you do, and having this team learning model is that, okay, you're able to connect that thing that you're good at to the overall mission or strategies and learn as a group. Because ultimately, you can only have shared, shared vision, shared mission, if you all connected up with group learning. And so those were Peter Singe's notions. And there was a lot of discussion about whether they were too dramatic or too idyllic and all that sort of stuff. And there still is. There's a lot of people that argue about it. But organizations, are built around 3 or 4 what this article calls building blocks. And let's see, I don't think there's a list of them, but and we'll kind of very quickly talk about those. Systematic problem solving. In other words, you know, you don't depend on epiphany. You have a, you know, sort of a systematic way of approaching problems, and that you have, maybe you have a problem solving space, or you have a brainstorming time during the week, or you have you know, retreats. Retreats got to be real big, because, you know, that was the notion that you could get a team off someplace and you know, do some problem solving without the day-to-day minutia getting in the way. I found that only worked if nobody took their phones along. But, you know, if you take your phone along, you're still going to want to connect back, and that never worked. But they talk about this notion of relying on a scientific, logical, systematic problem solving, and not relying on instinct or gut feeling or whatever, but relying on a systematic approach of collecting data, looking at a problem, peeling it apart, scaffolding it, do whatever you need to do to understand all the pieces of it, and then begin to put it back together and think about how to solve that problem as you put it back together. And so this sort of systematic problem solving, collection of data, I mean, you're seeing that debate right now in this country, because there are folks that, oh, we got to get back up, we got to get back to business. Well, yes, we do, but we do when the data gives us some indication that we'll be successful doing that, and won't be right back here 2 or 3 months from now shutting down again. And so that's the debate. You know, are we going to wait to collect the right kind of data to tell us we might be okay if we're real careful about it, as opposed to let's just throw the doors open and see what happens? It insists upon data rather than assumptions as background for decision making. Data is the background for decision making. Now, there is a connection here to sort of post-positivist thought and the notion of looking at critical theory. You know, one of the things that the post-positivists sort of insist upon, and Foucault is one of the main ones of those folks early on, is that you don't really start with the same assumptions you've always started with. You question the assumptions too. And so when you have a problem, you not only look at the problem, but you look at the assumptions you've been making in dealing with that problem. And if, you know, just because we've done something a certain way before, or we made a certain assumption, how do we know? You know, that there's an issue that maybe that's wrong. Maybe we started at the wrong place, used the wrong assumptions. And so in a learning organization, there is a little bit of that post-positivist sort of notion that we really look to see, are these assumptions even valid? Or if we change this one just a little bit, what's the effect of that? Using statistical analysis, charts, graphs, cause and effect, correlations, to try to make inferences as to what we need to do. One of my jobs at the community college when I was the director of institutional effectiveness was to use my other job, director of institutional research, to analyze data that would allow me to predict what we needed, where we needed to be next year in terms of staffing, in terms of space use, things like that, so that we wouldn't have each year kind of having to struggle at the beginning of the year to figure out, okay, well, who's going to teach that, or what are we going to do with that? We don't need 3 sections of that. And so I would run these projections, and I was only there a year and a half. So I ran them for like 3 semesters, and each semester they turned out to be, almost spot on. And it wasn't that I was doing anything magical. I was simply using the data, running, basic statistical modeling ideas to predict where we would be next semester after. And, that was, I found very interesting, but, then the 2 decision makers in the entire institution, they were the only 2 that ever made a decision. They didn't quite believe in those projections, and then so they would always undercut the projections and then have to find themselves moving towards those projections once they got into the semester. And that could be one reason that I decided that was not someplace I wanted to stay very long. But it was, that's what a learning company does. It uses data, it uses statistical modeling, statistical projections, uses all these sort of thinking skills to get in that. And then there's this notion of experimentation. One of the basic factors in a learning corporation is a willingness to get into experimentation. To look at the allocation of resources, to look at the, combining of processes, to look at allocation of labor resources, any of that stuff, to see what might be a better, more efficient way of doing things. Now, unfortunately, that's led to a big problem today, which is the automation of so many processes. That, when we open a new plant, we don't hire as many people as was in the old plant because it's more automated. Learning from past experience, don't repeat a mistake. Don't repeat, if we find that we keep making the same mistake or the same sorts of things keep happening, then it's probably something that we can change in an organization. I was at an institution where we had an enormous turnover rate in terms of faculty. And it was because JMU was seen as a stepping stone institution. In other words, you could come in as a young faculty member, get your tenure or be there 5-6 years or whatever, and be much more marketable going to the next place. Because the mentoring was, pretty strong in terms of sort of research in those areas, but it wasn't very strong in terms of, fitting into the university culture. And that was by design. They wanted a turnover. They wanted a constant influx of new ideas coming through. And so, but there was no institutional history because there weren't a lot of folks around that had been there longer than, 8 or 10 years. And so there was no real experience base or institutional history from which to learn. And so it was a flaw, which they have now fixed. Of course, a little bit more money in the salary scale also helped. Learning from others, being willing to look at alternative ways of thinking about things, alternative ways of doing things, and learning from others that have different experiences and different expertise. And not always assuming that, I like the phrase in here that Milken called SIS, or steal ideas shamelessly, but always give credit. If you don't give credit, you get in trouble. But you steal ideas and provide credit for it, but don't, steal good ideas, not just any old idea, but, learn from other people, learn from what other people's expertise is. And then finally, there's a couple more on the list in here, but this is the last one I want to mention, is this notion of transferring knowledge. How do you transfer knowledge from one department to another department, from the lab to actual production, from it's that transforming and transferring ideas into actions, and that requires that knowledge that you may acquire in a learning organization, you to be able to transfer it across the organization and out of the organization. And those are, sort of key building blocks that they speak to in terms of the Harvard Business Review article about building a learning corporation. But it's based on evidence, it's based on experimentation, it's based on trust in others, trust in your peers, and a willingness to listen. And those are sort of basic idioms within a learning organization. Any thoughts about that, or any of you in what you would call, at least on occasion, maybe a learning organization? Can't be that all the time, probably. I mean,
I would definitely say I've been at a few elementary schools that would be considered a learning organization, because we're always using data for instruction, but also like right now where I'm at, we use surveys and test scores and a plethora of data to either do something to see if something's working with our strategic plan or to make decisions. I think my frustration comes when we take the data and then we don't act upon it.
yeah.
But really, when I look at all the, we're always looking at how to problem solve and collect the data. And sometimes we'll collect data and we realize we've collected the wrong data. But we're solving another problem. And then as far as like assumptions, really looking at different perspectives. I think that's one of the things I've personally learned, over the last several years, is just taking that parent perspective, student perspective, faculty perspective, when there are concerns or things that are happening, because so often you assume you know the whole picture, but often there's many parts of the puzzle that you're not knowledgeable about. So, but yeah, this I related to very much, at least for me at a few of the schools that I've been at. And professional learning communities have attributed quite a lot to that knowledge base and continual learning process.
Yeah, professional learning came out of the whole notion of learning organization. It was but it also addressed another problem, and the other problem was the worthlessness of so much professional development that we did with teachers and people in educational settings, because a lot of it was focused around district-wide or statewide priorities, and most of the time the investment in those things are not very deep, at least in the local level. And so the conceptualization of professional learning communities was that you could use this learning model, this organizational learning model, this collaborative planning model, but first you had to find the space for it and find the time for it. And the best thing to get rid of was sort of these canned professional development stuff and things like that, and organize our schools and systems that kind of went that direction. They found it a very good model to go to. if you can apply it consistently and keep it going. Keep it going. That's always the tough part, is to keep any of these innovations going. Diane, you say that isothermal seems like a learning organization, a learning college to you?
It's one of our definitions. Even our tagline or motto is improve life through learning. And we have to consult our learning college manual all the time for our the things we're trying to look at, how we're improving.
Yeah.
For our assessment.
Yeah, somebody there had an affinity for Peter Senge, I think, because I mean he had the effect, and he still does. You can find his videos. He's still around, a little bit older, but he's still around. But you can find his videos, and those are very powerful. I saw a little 5-minute Peter Senge video that he did a couple of years ago, where he was talking about the importance of learning. And, you know, he was saying, forget about the, you know, all the taglines and, you know, those words, forget about all of that. Let's talk about what it really is and, you know, what it looks like. And, but he's a very powerful speaker. I mean, he kind of grabs you and takes you where he wants to take you. I don't know. I'm still waiting for my first pure learning organization. My experience has been tainted, because every time I hear somebody say they want to set up a learning organization or a learning college or whatever, the very first thing they want to do is they want to set it up exactly the way they want to set it up. Well, that's entirely antithetical to the idea of a learning organization. I mean, you organize kind of with the consensus of the organization based on the assumptions you have to operate with. And so, you know, maybe a dean wants a certain pattern, and his or her faculty don't want that at all, and they want to go, you know, with a different pattern or a different organizational structure or whatever. And so it's kind of hard to get people to think about a broader based learning organizational model. They'll adopt a learning organizational model on specific topics or specific issues. And I guess that's close enough. And so that's kind of, you know, my experiences, that you deal with sort of specific issues. Too much data. Yeah, that's always an issue, is too much data. You know, when I went in, I guess when I first became aware of the fact that schools collect way too much data for what they need, and they never look at most of it, is that I was, first time I was doing third-party evaluation on a project that was happening. It was an after-school, before school and after-school academies for you know, high school kids that didn't have really a nice, safe place to go home to or whatever. You know, they came from you know, families where their parents worked a couple of jobs, or there was only one parent there. You know, different scenarios, but they needed you know, they needed something to do before school, needed something to do after school, and we set it up as advisory periods, and you know, this notion of being attached to a particular faculty, so if you had a big problem or a big issue, you could go talk to that one faculty member. And so it was a mentoring academy sort of model, but it was based on some of the small school stuff that came out of the Northwest Regional Educational Lab in the 70s and late 60s and early 70s, which was some really cutting edge stuff. In fact, a lot of it's been adopted by the Gates Foundation, and a lot of their projects, educational projects, are built around some of those Northwest Lab stuff. But we got one of those grants, and I was the evaluator of it. And I went in, and I wanted to pull, I didn't want to look at all the folders in the school. I wanted to pull 100 folders of seniors, quote unquote graduating seniors, to see, what pattern of classes they'd taken, and, a couple of other things, because we wanted to help advise these kids in a more consistent, more coherent pattern. But the school didn't really have a model to go from. They didn't really have, we always take kids like this and we advise them to do this. They didn't have that. And so we were wanting to find out what that was. And so I wanted 100 random folders of graduating seniors for the last 3 years. And so 300 folders, that's all I wanted. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to get that in about, one banker's box thing. Those little banker's boxes that you put folders in and got the handles on the side and all that sort of stuff. And about the size of a box that reams of paper come in. And I thought I'd get one of those. I got 300 folders and it took 6 boxes. Because they had folders within folders. And some of those folders were 2, 3, 4 inches thick. And they had every bit of information about that kid on paper from the time they entered school. And they had collected enormous amounts of data, none of which they ever used for much of anything. And so I had my 6 boxes of 300 folders to look at. And so the research took slightly longer than I had anticipated to get done, but it did provide a lot of information. But it also, in my mind, sparked this notion of, schools collect an awful lot of data. And then I go to the community college, and I'm, director of institutional research. And anytime I have to answer a question, I have to go to 4 different databases. Because they have one for finances, they have a financial database. They have a faculty database with all the faculty scheduling stuff. They have a student schedule database. And they have a student outcomes database. And they were all developed by different groups. And so they didn't talk to each other nicely. And they had 4 different definitions of some things. A different definition for each database, slightly different. And so I learned I learned a lot from that too, in that not only do we have a lot of information, we also have a lot of information that doesn't line up in such a way that you can look at it together. And those are 2 big issues with schools. We have a lot of information, but we also have a lot of information in different patterns that don't line up with each other. And as a department head, when I was a department head, it used to drive me bananas, and I know why now, that we would get a request for some type of information. Then we get another request for the same information plus 1 more piece. Then we get another request for all of that minus 2 pieces. And I wonder, well, I'm sending all this stuff to you. Why can't you just look at it and pick out the pieces you need? And it was because they were all operating off of different databases too.
And it can even change from year to year because you collect it a little different, or you change the fields in your database. So if you think about those kids' records from kindergarten through 12th grade, the databases may have changed several times, especially if they moved.
And some of it was meaningless because you couldn't get a beat on anything because the definitions would change, from year to year or level to level. And so it's not having enough data. It's always having the right data to answer the question. And so the answer to a learning corporation is not generate more data, is to generate cleaner data. And have data that talks to each other. And when you have working groups that are working on things, use the common definitions. So one of my tasks that year, which I did accomplish on my spare time, was a sort of a dictionary of data definitions in these different databases, and which ones lined up with which ones, and which ones said this, that, and the other. And you know, that was an interesting experience too, just understanding the level of data we had, but the way in which the data didn't really allow us to answer the questions we needed to answer most of the time. So it was, you know, everything you do, you always learn a few lessons from. And sometimes the lessons are contradictory to other lessons you've learned. So that's kind of like, okay, what do you do here? You're loyal to whoever pays you. That was my model of it. Whoever was signing my checks, that's who I was loyal to in taking their interpretation. But it you know, this notion of a learning organization is a work in progress for higher education. We're so inertia driven. We're so driven by, at least on the academic side, by expertise and a concept that I may have mentioned before called content lust, where you assume that the one piece of content that the university can't do without is medieval history, or the one piece of content the university can't do without is, you know, organic chemistry, or, you know, whatever. And so you end up with faculty that you hire because they have a particular expertise and they're very good at what they do, and then ask them to not be so wedded to their expertise that they're not willing to listen to other people. And that's a big contradiction in higher education. So there are some hurdles to learning organizations in higher ed. But it's still probably the best model that's out there if we can figure out how to implement it. Good luck. I hope you figure it out. Yeah, I've only been working on it for about 40 years. I haven't gotten much of a handle on it yet, but it's a work in progress. But if we can ever get there, it could be a successful work in progress. Other thoughts about learning organizations? Okay, so what's left? Then over the next 2 days or so, I'm not going anywhere. I don't have any outside things to do. I can't, you know, all of our shopping is now automated. You know, a certain day, you know, Walmart shows up on a certain day, Chewy shows up on a certain, you know, so I just go to the door and answer, you know, wait till they drop it on the porch, pick it up. So, yeah. Reading papers is really an interesting product at this point for me. So at least it gives me a little something to do because everything else is on the back burner. I'll give you the best feedback I can on the paper that you just did. I still notice we're missing a few. I know a couple of you had some issues, and that's fine. You know, it'll take me a day or two to read all this stuff anyhow. When you submit the draft of this, which will be, in your mind, a final draft of your final project, I've built a little time in there for me to look at that also and provide, you know, some fairly quick feedback in terms of, you know, you might have missed this, or this logically doesn't make sense, and I don't see how this connects up with that totally, but, you know, think about how you said that, and, you know, things like that, and give you another, you know, few days with a final submission right before I have to clear grade stuff. And, you know, at this point, with the way the semesters have kind of happened and the chaos that we've all been operating under, I'm assuming if you've submitted all your assignments and responded, you know, to any feedback you might get on things, that, you know, you deserve an A. So that's where I'm at. But I know it has been not the best of experiences in some ways. And, yeah, I really can't. Yeah, I want to apologize for that because it's just crazy. It has been a crazy time, and I think the important thing is you get through it and you learn a few things and you move on and figure out how to get to the next normal, whatever that looks like. Isn't it kind of exciting to know that it's going to be different than what you were used to? Yeah. I suppose it's a little frightening, but I think it's kind of exciting. Yeah. Of course, I used to be into orienteering a lot, some when I was younger, and lived out in the mountains. And we'll grab a knife and a rifle and a poncho and a canteen and take off for 4 or 5 days out into the woods and just see what I could stumble into. Most of the time, I got back in one piece. Occasionally bore a scar or something for something I'd gotten into. Ran across a couple of bears. Once I actually ran across a mountain lion, and I think he wanted to eat me. He was following me around for a while, so I had to build a big fire and throw some rocks at him, but he didn't like any of that. But yeah, it's kind of exciting just to get out there and see if you can still survive like your ancestors did. I would not do that now. I like a nice bottle of wine, good cheeses, great cheeses, and Netflix and BritBox and things like that. So the world changes around you. You just do the best you can to stay a step ahead of it. Yeah. Next week I will be here. I'm not going to add any additional content. There's a couple of other pieces on learning organizations that readings are up for next time. Please, if you, I encourage you to read those. I would like to use as much time as we have next week that you want to take to answer particular individual questions about where your project's going, if we can. And if you'd rather that that discussion be between you and other folks, other members of the cohort or group members or whatever, that's fine too. But I'll be here and I'll be willing to talk about any of that stuff and work through it.
You had sent an email a few days ago or a week ago about you were working on getting through some of the giving feedback from the first paper. Did you do all those? Because I didn't get anything yet.
I did not. I got
okay.
And we had one of those family things Thursday. Our almost 10-year-old puppy, dog that slept with Jenny and I all the time, and she always told him that he was the love of her life. I'm sitting there and the dog is the love of her life, but he's the sweetest dog in the world, a Schnauzer Spaniel thing. Mm-hmm. 3 nights ago, I guess I heard him in the middle of the night, which is odd because normally he's in bed. And he was having strokes.
Oh.
And, within 16, 18 hours, he was gone. But he was perfectly healthy the day before. We were out, walking and running around the backyard, stuff like that.
Wow.
It was one of those sudden things, and you're going to with everything else going on, my focus got a little.
Oh no, I understand. I just wanted to make sure I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss it. So.
No, they're on it's on the first of the list of things that I hope to get through tomorrow and the day after. And then the second paper, I'll get into those. And the time it takes to give feedback is not very long. It's just getting clear of enough other stuff to focus on those things to actually do them. But everything else is on the back burner. And obviously my wife and I are kind of laying extra low right now, just kind of it's amazing how connected you get to those little boogers. And you tell yourself every time, you know, we're not going to do that again. And here you go. And so we're not quite ready for another one yet, but we have a cat, and that tells you enough that we're not ready for another dog if all you have is a cat. I'm sorry. Did I offend any cat people? I'm sorry. Cats are there for amusement. They're like watching an alien species and trying to figure out what they're thinking and what they're doing. And dogs are there because they love you. And so you got to go that way. So anyhow, I'm sorry, folks.
Oh, it's fine.
I didn't, but yeah, I gotta go because now I'm going to start tearing up because I do miss the little booger. Got to know each other pretty well. Okay, so next week I'll be here. Any comments? If you want to talk about stuff between now and then, give me a yell. We'll pop in a Zoom or something like that, and we'll talk it through. I'm kind of available. I'm not going anywhere.
I wanted to confirm when the paper is due. I think I had different dates, like June 7th is the draft, and then it's due by May the 7th. Was that correct?
No, it's something different there. Let me look. Let me see. It's
Because I know next Monday is April 27th, I believe.
let me get back over the syllabus. Not syllabus, the email thing. If I can remember where that's at. Hold on just a second. May 7th. Okay. Yeah, that's not clear. 7th, May 7th is like, in your mind, what you have to think of as a final draft. Okay. And then I've got, what's my calendar say? Okay. The 7th is that first draft thing. And then I'll get those turned around. Any comments, any extra things needed by, say, the 9th or so, by that weekend, Saturday the 9th. And then any changes would be due by the 15th. Yes, 15th. Because I have to turn grades in on the 18th. Yeah, 18th, I think. So the 7th and 15th, I'm sorry. I will put that on the As You Learn page.
Would you repeat that just for one more time?
The 7th and the 15th. 7th is for basically a final draft, which if it is a final draft, I'll send you a message back with a couple of days, say, here, it's done. It's successful. Here are some thoughts about things that if you did want to, use it for something else or, clean it up or whatever, you might want to think about this. Or you'll get, okay, well, I've looked at it. Here are some thoughts. Here's a couple of things that maybe you need to think about revising and resubmitting. So I'll be very clear about whether you need to resubmit it or whether this is it. Here's some thoughts, though, that you might want to think if you're going to use it for something else. And only if I tell you you have to resubmit it, will you resubmit it on the 15th, by the 15th.
Okay, thank you.
I've also, in my ramblings for the last 2 or 3 days, I've also decided to set a retirement date for myself. So it is 2023. Why? I don't know. It's a good number. It's also the year before I have to go up for another 5-year full review, which I don't want to go through that crap again. So I've done 40 some odd years of this stuff, and 2 or 3 more years will be enough. And now I have to make sure that I live by that and don't change my mind between now and 2023. I told my wife that, and she said, means nothing. So tell me that in 2023 and I'll believe you. So we'll see how it goes. But third time's a charm. Third time to retire would be a charm. So that's where I'm going. All right, folks. If you want to talk or ask questions or whatever, I'll see you next week. If you want to email me and we can Zoom or go back and forth on some email stuff before then, feel free. And have a great weekend. Stay safe, and wash your hands and wear your face covering and all that good stuff. And we'll all get through this, and it'll be the idiots that we'll be laughing at some point in time. There's some weird stuff going on out there. I don't know. I can't explain them. I really can't explain them. Okay. All right, folks. Have a good evening, and I'll maybe see you next week. Maybe not. So
Thank you.
have a good one.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Stephanie, do you have a question or something?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Valerie and I have to work on another project that we're working on together.
Stay in. Yeah.
So we thought we'd hijack the rest of
Okay.
what you
I
had.
Then I won't end the meeting. I'll just I'll go away.
Okay.
I'll cut off my video, cut off my sound, and y'all can.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm gonna dial back in real quick just because I can hear you better that way. So
Okay.
just a second.
Yeah, look at those things. Look at those things. Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Yeah, I'm good. I was just sitting here writing that final paper for him while they were in class because I was like, I can't take it anymore. So
Yeah, I still have that one left
I
to
got to
do.
get that paper done. Yeah.
That one I still have left to do. My theory of theory to practice says it's done. I just need to make sure it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I knew that